This episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is supported by Shopify. I will be the first to admit that starting this podcast was a massive learning curve. I thought it was just about the audio, but suddenly I was dealing with marketing and logistics and it got overwhelming fast. Having the right tools is absolutely essential. So that is why I always point people towards Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of brands, from huge household names to small businesses just getting started. And it's built to feel like your own built-in business partner. You can launch a beautiful online store using hundreds of ready-to-go templates, accelerate your content creation with Shopify's AI tools, and easily run email and social campaigns that help you reach customers wherever they're scrolling. Plus, Shopify gives you world-class expertise across everything, from inventory and payment to shipping, returns, and international selling, all in one place. So if you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your €1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.ie. That's shopify.ie and see what you can accomplish with Shopify by your side.
Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries, brought to you by Revive Active, scientifically formulated and manufactured in Ireland. Available at all good health food stores and pharmacies or at reviveactive.com.
Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by Go Loud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the Go Loud app and on your favourite podcast platform. Hey everyone, it's Nules here and welcome to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Before we begin, I want to share a personal recommendation for our new sponsor, Revive Active. I've always been sceptical of supplements that promise the world, but this is different. It's an Irish company that pioneered the super supplement over 15 years ago. I've been taking it every morning. It is a morning ritual that I look forward to, and I love the confidence it gives me knowing I'm looking after my health and well-being every day. Each sachet contains premium ingredients, scientifically formulated at the correct levels so you feel the benefits. It's one single sachet that delivers so much goodness in a glass in a way that's so much easier than swallowing lots of tablets. You can find them at reviveactive.com or in pharmacies or health food stores nationwide. It's a small change to your day with a big impact. Now, on with the show. Today's case takes us back to the small townsland in South Tipperary of Marlhill, to a murdered mother of 6 and a man hanged by the Irish state for a crime he did not commit. Last week, we left Moll McCarthy in an unmarked grave in a disused cemetery in New Inn. We left Harry Gleeson buried inside the eastern yard of Mountjoy Prison, and both of them should have stayed there forever, forgotten. But that is not what happened. Because of an old friend who sat down at a kitchen table 40 years later and decided he had had enough, and because of a state that, after 74 years, was finally forced to admit it. This is The Murder at Marlhill Part 2, The Pardon. I'm Nules, and welcome back to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. If you haven't listened to Part 1 yet, I'd urge you to go back and listen to it before you start this one. Part 2 only kind of makes sense if you've heard Part 1, obviously. So for everyone else, welcome back. Now, just to bring us back to where we were, on the night of the 20th of November 1940, Moll McCarthy was shot dead in her cottage at Marlhill, or in the field beside it, twice with a shotgun. The fatal shot was to the right side of her neck. She was 38 years old and she left behind 6 living children. 9 days later, the man who had found her body, her neighbour Harry Gleeson, was arrested for her murder. 5 months after that, on the morning of Wednesday the 23rd of April 1941, Harry was hanged at Mountjoy Prison. And in his last hours, the prison governor, the prison doctor, the chaplain and the prison warders all came into his cell to be with him, because not one of them believed the man they were about to hang had killed anybody. Harry Gleeson never confessed to the murder of Moll McCarthy because Harry Gleeson did not kill Moll McCarthy. And before we go any further, there is one thing from Part 1 that I want you to keep in your head all the way through this episode, because, as I said, it is the thread that ties this whole story together. More than 50 years after the murder, Moll's eldest daughter unburdened herself to that nurse in Donnybrook in Dublin. I mean, she had spent part of her life in a Magdalen laundry, and as she lay dying, she said something to the nurse on duty that night that the country would not hear about for another 20 years. She said, "I saw my own mother shot on the kitchen floor and an innocent man died." Now, after the hanging, that was the end of it as far as anyone was concerned. The Gleeson family in Holy Cross did not talk about Harry. The shame of having a son and a brother hanged for murder in Ireland in 1941 was just too much. In New Inn, the case went underground in a different way. The people who knew kept their mouths shut. The people who didn't know were never told. And the priest, the Gardaí, and a few well-placed families in the village were happy to let Harry Gleeson lie forgotten in his unmarked grave in Mountjoy. And it stayed that way for 40 years. Then, sometime in the 1980s, a man called Bill O'Connor sat down at his kitchen table in Tipperary and decided he had had enough. Bill O'Connor was known to everyone as Billo. He had been a good friend of Harry's back in the day. He knew Harry as a quiet man who kept himself and worked hard, not the sadist the Gardaí had made him out to be, and Billo had carried this with him for 40 years. So Billo did the only thing he could do. He sat down and wrote it all down. Everything he knew about the case, everything he had picked up around the parish over the decades, everything that had never made it into the courtroom. He put it all into a small private publication. He called it The Farcical Trial of Harry Gleeson, and he had it printed himself. Now, Billo wasn't a barrister, he wasn't a journalist, he was just an ordinary man who knew his friend was innocent and was not going to die without saying it. But that little pamphlet did one very important thing. It got into the right hands. It got into the hands of a man called Marcus Burke. Marcus was a historian and a lawyer. And when Marcus read what Billo had written, he couldn't let it go either. So Marcus went and did what all historians do. He went and got the original Garda file. He went and got the trial transcripts. He went and tracked down the people in New Inn and Holy Cross who would still talk to him. And he wrote a book about it. Marcus Burke's book was published in 1993. It was called Murder at Marlhill, and the subtitle was a question. Was Harry Gleeson innocent? ? Burke didn't answer that question outright. What he did was lay out the evidence and let the reader make up their own mind. But the way he laid it out, no honest reader could come to any other conclusion than the obvious one. Harry Gleeson had been framed. And Burke's book was followed in 1995 by an RTE documentary presented by Cathal O'Shannon that brought the case to a national audience for the first time. People in this country who had never heard of Harry Gleeson sat down on a Tuesday night in 1995 and watched a documentary about a man the Irish state had hanged 54 years earlier for a crime he hadn't done. Sadly, Billo did not live to see the pardon. He died in 2001. But that little homemade pamphlet of his, written at his own kitchen table in the 1980s, was the spark that started the whole thing off. As one local writer later put it, Billo would be the first man Harry would thank in heaven. And you couldn't put it better than that. After the documentary, the case went a bit quiet again, but not completely. People in Tipperary still talked about it. Marcus Burke kept researching. The book stayed in print. But there was no formal campaign yet, no legal case, no mechanism to actually do anything about it. Then, in 2012, a group of locals in Tipperary, alongside members of the Gleeson family, sat down and decided to do something properly. They called themselves the Justice for Harry Gleeson Group. The three men at the centre of it were a local man called Sean Delaney, Harry's nephew Tom Gleeson, and Tom's son Kevin Gleeson, who was Harry's grandnephew. And they took on something none of them had any obligation to take on. They took on the work of clearing the name of a relative they had never met. Tom and Kevin had grown up knowing only that there was a great uncle the family didn't talk about. And now they were the ones that were going to make the country talk about him. The group did two very important things. The first was that they gathered all the evidence into one place. Marcus Burke's research, Billo's pamphlet, the Garda file, the trial transcripts. They started putting together a paper trail that the Department of Justice would have to take seriously. The second was that they teamed up with the people who knew how to use that paper trail. They reached out to the Irish Innocent Project at Griffith College in Dublin, run by a man called David Langwallner, who was the Dean of Law there. The Innocence Project is part of an international network that goes back over suspect convictions and tries to get them overturned. And the Innocence Project took on Harry's case. They brought in their own legal expertise. They brought in forensic experts. And they had one thing that Marcus Burke had never been able to do. They brought in a US forensic pathologist called Dr. Peter Cummings. Dr. Cummings is the Director of Forensic Neuropathology at the Boston office of the Chief Medical Examiner. He's one of only a handful of forensic specialists in the world who has ever had access to John F. Kennedy's original autopsy materials. He is top of his field, and the Innocent Project asked him to look at the medical evidence in Harry Gleeson's case. And what Dr. Cummings found was that the time of death the prosecution had given to the jury back in 1941 was wrong. The prosecution had argued that Moll was killed on the night of the 20th of November, the night when, by their theory, Harry was free and unaccounted for. Dr. Cummings concluded from the medical evidence that the death was actually more likely on the 21st of November. And on the 21st of November, Harry Gleeson had an alibi. So now they had it. The witnesses had been intimidated, the gun register had been hidden, the confrontation with the children had been stage managed, and now time of death itself was wrong. And there was one more piece of evidence that came to light during this period, and the way it came to light is quite remarkable, really. Bernadette Gorman was the daughter of Billy Gorman. Billy was Harry's friend, the man who had spent the whole summer of 1939 working the trashing with Harry. The man who had said, if Harry Gleeson fathered that child, there must be two Harry Gleesons. The man who had been such a crucial witness for the defence, but had never been called to give evidence. Bernadette had grown up watching her father carry the regret of that case for the rest of his life. He never got over not being allowed to testify. So when the campaign got underway, Bernadette wanted to do whatever she could to help. And it was Bernadette who, while going through Marcus Burke's old research papers years later, came across a letter that nobody had paid much attention to before. It was the letter from Father John Kelly, the prison chaplain, the priest who had stayed with Harry through the night before his execution. The day after Harry was hanged, Father Kelly had sat down and wrote that letter to Anna Conway down in New Inn, describing Harry's last hours. The stream of warders coming into the cell to wish him farewell, the governor coming last, Harry's last words, "My God, I love you." And that letter had survived all those years in among Marcus Burke's papers. And when Bernadette pulled it out, the campaign suddenly had an account, written by a Catholic priest the day after the execution, describing the demeanour and the last hours of a man who was going to his death as an innocent man. Shane Murphy, the senior counsel who eventually reviewed the whole case, would later say that Father Kelly's letter showed Harry in a very different light to the picture the superintendent had painted in his letter to the Department of Justice. The superintendent had called Harry a sadist. The chaplain had called him a man preparing to meet God. And it was Bernadette Gorman who found that letter, the daughter of the man who had never been allowed to speak for Harry in 1941. By 2013, the file was complete. The Justice for Harry Gleeson group, working alongside the Irish Innocence Project, had assembled everything, and they sent it to the Department of Justice. The Minister for Justice at the time was Alan Shatter, and Shatter did the right thing. He did not sit on it. He passed the file straight to the Attorney General, Mary Whelan, and Mary Whelan in turn appointed a senior counsel, a man called Shane Murphy, to review the entire case from start to finish and to make a recommendation to the government. Shane Murphy spent the best part of a year going through it all. The Garda file, the trial transcripts, the medical evidence, the new forensic work by Dr. Cummings, the fact Billy Gorman had never been called to give evidence, Tommy Reid's statement and how it had been gotten out of him, the hidden gun register, Father Kelly's letter, everything. And Shane Murphy concluded what every honest person who has ever looked at this case from outside had concluded. Harry Gleeson was convicted on unconvincing circumstantial evidence. The whole proceedings amounted to grave defects in the administration of justice, and the conviction was unsafe. Murphy recommended a posthumous pardon, the first in the history of the Irish state. By the time Murphy delivered his findings, Alan Shatter was no longer Minister for Justice. He had resigned during the Garda whistleblower controversy that was going on at the time. The new minister was Francis Fitzgerald, and it was Francis Fitzgerald who would deliver Murphy's conclusions to the country. On the 1st of April 2015 in Dáil Éireann, Francis Fitzgerald stood up and announced that the government would direct the President of Ireland to exercise his constitutional power of pardon in the case of Harry Gleeson, executed by the state on the 23rd of April 1941. And in her statement, Francis Fitzgerald did something no Irish minister had ever done in the Dáil before. She apologised on behalf of the Irish state to the Gleeson family for the wrongful conviction and execution of an innocent man. She also acknowledged Moll. The minister said the pardon left unresolved the brutal murder of Mary McCarthy, whose children were deprived of their mother in appalling circumstances. So at least now it was on record. The state recognised that 2 victims had been failed in 1940 and in 1941, respectively. And finally, it was being said out loud. There had been 2 victims at Marlhill all along, Harry and Moll herself. On the 19th of December 2015, President Michael D. Higgins signed the pardon order under Article 13 of the Constitution, the first posthumous pardon ever issued in this country. The wording of it was that it cleared Harry's name as if he had never been charged or convicted of anything. And on the 13th of January 2016, the formal pardon document was presented to the Gleeson family at a ceremony in Dublin. The campaign group, the Innocence Project, and members of the Gleeson family who had carried this case for decades were finally able to put the document into their own hands. Despite a discrepancy with the name on the certificate, the pardon used the name Harry, not Henry. The family accepted the certificate gratefully. Now, Harry's actual baptismal name was Henry. He was Henry Gleeson on the day he was born, and he was Henry Gleeson on the day he was hanged. Harry was just a nickname. Now, the pardon was one thing, and it was one fantastic thing. But bringing him home was another thing entirely. After Harry was hanged in 1941, his body was buried, as the law required, in an unmarked grave in the eastern yard of Mountjoy Prison, alongside the other men the state had executed. There was no record kept of exactly where each man was. They were just in the ground somewhere in that part of the yard that backed onto the canal. And the family wanted Harry home. The state had hanged him. They had put him in an unmarked grave. And then for over 70 years, they had done absolutely nothing to keep track of where they had put his remains. There was no headstone, there was no plot number, there was no plaque. He was just somewhere in the eastern yard. So when the family finally asked, after the pardon had come through, to have his remains brought back to Tipperary for proper Christian burial, the state could not even tell them where he was. The first search for Harry's remains took 5 years and it failed. They could not find him. In 2023, the Department of Justice announced a fresh search would be conducted, this time using forensic archaeology of a section of land at Mountjoy that was slightly more than 1,000 square metres. They knew the bodies of executed prisoners were buried somewhere on the eastern side of the prison, back towards the canal. And on the 8th of January 2024, the excavation work began. The team leading the dig were 2 forensic archaeologists, Niamh McCullough and Aidan Hart of ARC Forensics. Both of them had previously worked with the Independent Commission for the location of victims' remains. The commission set up to locate the bodies of people who had been killed and secretly buried by the IRA across this country. They disappeared, as they came to be known. So the same forensic experts who had spent years trying to find the bodies of Trouble's victims were now trying to find the body of a man his own country had hanged in 1941, dumped and lost track of. And after years of failed searches, the forensic team got it right this time. On the 21st of June 2024, after months of careful work in the eastern yard of Mountjoy, the remains of Harry Gleeson were positively identified through DNA matching with surviving family. Tom and Kevin Gleeson got the call from the Department of Justice that week. Their uncle and granduncle Harry, who had walked into Mountjoy Prison in 1941 as an innocent man, was finally being released 83 years late. On Friday the 5th of July 2024 at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Tom and Kevin Gleeson, along with members of the Justice for Harry Gleeson group, walked into Mountjoy prison to bring Harry home. Mountjoy meant something specific to that family. It was the building that had hanged their relative for a crime he didn't do. It was the place that had buried him without a marker. For 83 years, every member of the Gleeson family who had grown up knowing the truth had had Mountjoy in their head as the place that took Harry from them. And here they were now, walking through the gates of that same building to take their innocent man back home. They were greeted by governors, chiefs and prison officers. They were taken on a short walk around the outside of the prison and brought to the hanghouse, the same building where Harry had been led from his cell on the morning of the 23rd of April 1941 and walked a few yards to the trapdoor and the noose. A prison officer told them the history of it. He told them in detail what had happened that morning to Harry Gleeson. Then they were taken to the spot where Harry's remains had been found a few months earlier. The site was enclosed. The team of archaeologists were there. They came to the gate to bid farewell to Harry. They pointed out the exact place on the site where Harry's remains had lain for 83 years under concrete, and they were visibly moved as Harry's remains left the site. They had found him. They had brought him out of the Mountjoy clay. They had identified him with DNA, and now they were handing him back to his family. Harry's remains had been placed in a coffin. The hearse was waiting, and as the hearse made its way through the prison grounds, an eerie silence came over the place. And even some of the prisoners who were working on an outside project stood respectfully as the hearse passed by. And as they got to the front gates, prison officers and prison staff formed a guard of honour. They stood there in silence and watched as the hearse passed through, dignified and respectfully. The same prison service that had hanged Harry Gleeson in 1941 was now seeing him out in 2024, an entirely innocent man. The hearse turned left out of the gates onto the North Circular Road and took its place in the Dublin traffic, heading south for Tipperary. But that was only the beginning of the homecoming. Because once that hearse crossed the Tipperary border beyond Urlingford and made it through the turnpike and started heading on into Thurles, something extraordinary started to happen. A Garda escort took over and led the hearse through the town and into Liberty Square. Now, if you know Thurles at all, Liberty Square is the heart of it. Shops, pubs, the lot. And as Harry Gleeson's hearse came through, people in the town stopped what they were doing. Many of them bowed their heads and blessed themselves as Harry's remains passed by. Cars pulled in, shoppers stood and waited. The hearse made its way out by the old sugar factory and on by Cabra towards the Yellow Lock. All the places Harry Gleeson would have known well, walked, cycled, driven cattle along. And then came the Yellow Lock crossroads leading into Galbertstown, Harry's home place. A large crowd had gathered there, and as the hearse pulled up to the crossroads, the people standing there started clapping, just on instinct. Harry Gleeson was coming home to his own, to the locals, to the people who had known the family for generations, to Galbertstown. A bonfire was lighting at the crossroads. Somebody was playing the Galbertstown waltz on the accordion. A short distance up the road is the Gleeson family home, the same house Harry had been born and reared in. And as the hearse turned up that road, a member of An Garda Síochána in full uniform stood on the road at the entrance to the family home, and he saluted Harry's remains as the hearse passed. Up the avenue to the house, locals and family and neighbours had lined up on both sides, a guard of honour for an innocent man. The hearse made its final short journey up to the door of Tom Gleeson's house. Tom is Harry's nephew. Many people had gathered outside, and among them, in the front of the crowd, stood a 90-year-old woman, Kitty Quinn, Harry's niece. She had been only 6 years old the day her uncle was hanged in Mountjoy, and Kitty herself said she had no memory of Harry because people just didn't talk about him much afterwards. And here she was, 90 years of age, standing in the yard of her cousin's house, watching her uncle finally come home, after waiting most of her life for it. A round of applause as the coffin came out of the hearse, then silence as it was carried into the house. And then, in that yard at Galbertstown, in front of a crowd that had gathered, an in-law of the family lifted Harry Gleeson's own fiddle and started to play. The same fiddle that had been hidden from the Gardaí in 1940. The same fiddle Harry himself had played in the kitchen at Marlhill the year before he was arrested. He played Slieve na Mon, he played Danny Boy, he played the Coolin. And the crowd stood in the yard and listened. The sound of Harry's own fiddle played by a man Harry had never met on the day Harry came home, and he played it beautifully. Harry's remains were laid out for a private wake at Galbertstown that night. On Sunday, the 7th of July 2024, Holy Cross Abbey was filled to capacity, with hundreds more outside that couldn't get in. The funeral mass was due to start at 2 o'clock. The hearse arrived at 1:30 after travelling from Galbertstown. Kitty sat in the front of the hearse on the journey from Galbertstown to Holy Cross, acknowledging the crowds along the route, the last living link to Harry Gleeson. And Kitty said something afterwards. She said, "I thank God I was spared to see this day." People were lined along the route in a guard of honour. Many of them reached out to touch the hearse as it passed. People who had never known Harry, never met any member of his family, but who had followed this story for years and wanted to be there at the end of it. Inside the Abbey, Harry's coffin was carried to the front. A black and white photograph of Harry was placed on top of it. Harry as a young man. Harry as he had been before this miscarriage of justice happened to him. And then, one of the most beautiful moments of the day, right at the start of the Mass, a great-grandnephew of Harry's, also called Harry, walked up the aisle of Holy Cross Abbey alongside his mother, carrying Harry's fiddle. Now in part 1, I told you the fiddle had its own story, and here it is. When the Gardaí started searching houses around Marlhill and New Inn during their investigation in late 1940, taking anything that could be used as evidence, somebody in the family had taken Harry's fiddle and buried it. They wrapped it up and put it into the ground, so that whatever happened to Harry, they would still have his fiddle. And on the day they finally brought Harry home, 83 years later, his great-grandnephew Harry, named for him, walked up the aisle of Holy Cross Abbey carrying that very fiddle to the altar. They placed it on top of Harry's coffin beside the photograph. The funeral mass was celebrated by Father Tierney, the parish priest of Holy Cross, with the Archbishop of Cashel and Emly, Kieran O'Reilly, assisting, alongside several other priests. Father Tierney told the mourners that today was a sad day and also a joyous day. Sad because of all that had been lost. Joyous because Harry was finally being laid to rest as an innocent man. And in the prayers of the funeral mass, the family had made one request. They had asked that the mass include prayers for Mary Moll McCarthy, the woman whose murder had started the whole thing. So in Holy Cross Abbey on the 7th of July of 2024, prayers were said for both Harry and Moll, the two victims of Marlhill, named together in the same mass for the very first time. Before the mass concluded, two of Harry's grandnieces, Anne and Mary Bridget Gleeson, walked up to the altar to pay their own tribute. And it was Anne who did something very special. Anne said to the congregation, "We must never forget Harry's last words to Sean MacBride." And then she read out, word for word, the letter Harry had written from his cell in Mountjoy on the night before he was hanged. The same letter MacBride had kept for the rest of his life. These were the words. "The last thing I want to say is that I will pray tomorrow that whoever did it will be discovered, and that the whole thing will be like an open book. I rely on you to clear my name. I have no confession to make, only that I didn't do it. That is all. If, like the rest of us, tears swamp your eyes, replace them with a smile and rejoice with us in the music of truth, justice and peace at last." So Harry Gleeson, on the night before they hanged him in 1941, had asked Sean MacBride to clear his name. And in his own home parish, with his own people around him, his own great-grandniece read those words out loud to a packed Holy Cross Abbey, 83 years later. After the Mass, the coffin was carried out of the Abbey by family members, and the procession walked the short distance to St Mary's Cemetery. And as his coffin came out of the Abbey, his fiddle was lifted again by a family member who started to play. He walked in front of the coffin as it entered the cemetery, still playing the fiddle. Some beautiful tunes. There was also a song that was written especially for Harry, played as well. And Harry Gleeson was buried in the family plot in St Mary's Cemetery, Holy Cross, beside his own people in the place he had grown up. So that's where Harry rests now, buried at home with his name on the headstone. And what about Moll? Moll McCarthy lies to this day in New Inn. The only acknowledgement of her at all is a small plaque on the wall of the cemetery, put up privately in her memory. Frances Fitzgerald in the Dáil in 2015 acknowledged Moll's murder. She said it remained unsolved. She said it had left Moll's children without their mother. But the Irish state has never apologised to Moll McCarthy. The Irish state has never given her a proper grave. The Irish state has never offered her family any recognition. And I find that so sad. Because Moll McCarthy was killed twice. The first time by whoever pulled that trigger in November of 1940. The second time by the country that decided for the next 83 years that her murder was an inconvenience to be tidied up rather than a crime to be solved. Her children paid for it too. The 6 surviving children were scattered. Some went into industrial schools, some went into Magdalen laundries. Mary, the eldest, the 19-year-old who had been at home that November night, ended up in a Magdalen laundry herself before being released decades later. So when we talk about who got justice in this case, we have to be honest about it. Harry got justice. The Gleeson family got justice. They got it 74 years too late, but they got it, and rightly so. But Moll McCarthy got nothing. Which brings us to the question that the Irish state has never answered, and that, as of today, all these years later, is still officially open. Who killed Moll McCarthy? There have been theories over the years. The historian Marcus Burke, in his 1993 book Murder at Marlhill, named no killer. According to others who have looked at the case since, Burke knew exactly who had done it, but chose not to put a name to it in print. One of the main theories is that Moll was killed by a small local group, men with a Republican background, who suspected her of passing information to the local Garda sergeant. If that theory is correct, Moll was killed because she was thought to be an informer. And the people who killed her had every reason in the world to want Harry Gleeson, an outsider on John Caesar's farm, to be the man to take the blame. Another theory put forward by the historian Brendan O'Cahir back in 2001 is that the killer might have been within the Gardaí themselves, or the father of Moll's 7th child. Different motives, different killers. So, in the 86 years since Moll McCarthy was shot dead, nobody has ever been brought to justice for her killing. And honestly, it is very, very unlikely now that anybody ever will be. And that brings us back to Mary McCarthy and those 15 words she said that night to the nurse in the hospital in Donnybrook. I saw my own mother shot on the kitchen floor and an innocent man died. Mary did not say, I believe my mother was murdered. She did not say, I think someone else did it. She said, I saw my own mother shot. She was a witness. She was 19 years old at the time, and she said on her deathbed that she had been there and she saw it happen. And she said her mother was shot on the kitchen floor. Moll's body was found in a field, the dugout field on John Caesar's farm, on the morning of the 21st of November 1940 by Harry Gleeson. She was lying out on the frozen ground. So if Mary's words on her deathbed were true, and Anne Martin Walsh believed they were, then Moll McCarthy was not killed in the field at all. She was killed in her own kitchen, in front of at least one of her own children. And then her body was carried or dragged out of the cottage, across to John Caesar's land and dumped in the dugout field for somebody to find in the morning. And if that's true, it changes the whole story. It would explain why Dr. Peter Cummings concluded the actual time of death was the 21st of November and not the 20th, because the body had been moved, and the moving of the body changes the markers a pathologist uses to fix a time of death. It would explain why the field where Harry found her had no signs of a struggle, because the struggle hadn't happened in the field. It would explain why Moll's coat was on her when Harry found her in the morning, because somebody had put it on her after the killing. And it raises a question I cannot answer. Was Moll's body deliberately moved to that particular field on Harry Gleeson's uncle's farm by people who wanted Harry Gleeson to be the man who found her and the man who got the blame? I don't know. We don't know. We probably never will know. But Mary McCarthy on her deathbed said she had seen it happen. And she said an innocent man died, and the state has now formally accepted with a posthumous pardon that an innocent man did indeed die. And Martin Walsh believes Mary wanted to send a message, and that message was that Harry Gleeson was innocent. And if that's what Mary was doing, the message, thankfully, has been received. So that's the murder at Marlhill. It took 83 years, but Harry Gleeson got his justice in the end. He got his pardon. He got his good name back. He got his funeral. He got to come home to his own people, to his own parish, to where he always belonged. And hopefully someday Moll McCarthy will get her justice too. Join me next week for another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. That's it for another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Thank you for joining me, and thanks again to our new sponsor, Revive Active. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you're looking to support your health daily, do give Revive Active, the super supplement, a try. It's been Ireland's #1 supplement brand for 5 years now. And being Irish made, you know the quality is there. Whether it's for immune support, health, or just that steady energy to get you through the day, it's a ritual worth starting. Check them out at reviveactive.com or your local pharmacy. I'm Nules, and thank you for your support. And I'll be back next week with another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries.
Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Brought to you by Revive Active, Ireland's #1 vitamin and dietary supplement brand. Find out more at reviveactive.com or your local pharmacy and health food stores.